All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, and tonight Books and Books is very happy to present another in our series of Exile Books Talks. Tonight's guests are Ruth and Marvin Sachner. Their presentation this evening is entitled Six from the Sixties. And here to introduce Mr. and Mrs. Sachner, please welcome the founder of Exile Books, Ms. Amanda Keeley.
Thank you very much for all coming out tonight. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces. This is the second talk of Exile Books at Books and Books, and we're so happy to have Ruth and Marvin Sachner here to join us. I wanted to also say thank you to Mitch Kaplan and to Books and Books for having us occupy the west wing of the store. After the talk, please take some time to go through and peruse the material. Also, if you can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and subscribe to keep us updated with the calendar as we move from location to location. I'd like to talk a little bit about Marvin and Ruth and the Sachner Archive of Concrete and Visual Poetry. It was established in 1979, and it is the largest collection of word image works in the world. It's over 75,000 records and over 225,000 items. They have personally archived over 59,000 records associated with over 22,000 images. That's a lot. I had to write this down because I still couldn't quite grasp how much material that is. The archive is not just books and artwork. This is something that I was really... It really struck me when I first came to visit the Sachners and had an opportunity to visit them and meet them in the archive. It's not just books and artwork. It also contains ephemera, manuscripts, correspondences, exhibition, announcements, and other poets and artists' archives, which is really remarkable because it's not just a collection. It is an archive, and it is available, and it has open access to scholars and to artists, which is incredibly valuable. I consider it a cultural pillar of Miami, and it's also very legendary. It's a treasure, and we in Miami are so thankful to have the Sachners here and have them be so passionate and dedicated to preserving this material and allowing us all to experience it. I would like to just go ahead and start with Marvin talking, but before you begin, I also wanted to mention that Marvin has an amazing book coming out called The Art of Typewriting, correct? Which will be released by Thames and Hudson as a hardcover book with over 400 images. And so we're really excited about that. And without further ado, Marvin, thank you very much.
Tonight I'm going to discuss the individuals and their work of six from the 60s. Why did I pick that? Well, these six people are all integral parts of our collections. They all lived in the United Kingdom. They started their artistic careers in the 50s and reached their peaks and more than that in the 60s. And they all knew each other. They often collaborated, but they were not a group. They were completely individualistic. The first one is Tom Phillips, who is the major artist, poet, polymath in our collection, born in 1937. We saw his work for the first time at the Basel Kunsthalle in 1975. I should tell you that I'm a physician and also a researcher, and every time I go to a research meeting, a medical meeting, I always get to a museum, see the art galleries, see the artists, and so forth, and that happened to be one of those visits. We didn't know who Tom Phillips was. We happened into the Basel Kunsthalle where there was a show of Tom Phillips and Noel Foster, another British artist. When we saw the work, we said, well, maybe Tom Phillips is a group, just like some of the musical groups. It's not just one person, because the work was so diverse and so interesting that we were blown away. We saw for the first time the original pages of a Mint, which I told Mitchell to order some. Maybe he did or he didn't. And this is a trade edition. It's now in his fifth edition. And this is where Tom took a Victorian novel by Mallock from the 1890s and altered the pages to leave a new poetry in the book. And Mitchell does have some, so you can take a look at them later on. It's now in the 5th edition. But the original pages were between two panes of glass, and we said, this is absolutely fantastic. I knew nothing about artist books. This is probably the first artist book I actually ever saw. In the Kunsthalle, you could get the prices at the desk for the various artworks. So I looked at the prices, and this was a large amount of money. I said, well, we really should get that, but we just don't have the money to do it. I should also tell you that I'm an inventor, and I started collecting in 1972 contemporary art, constructivism, from the royalties. But of course, that soon went past and was coming out of my salary and borrowing all the other stuff. But even then, I couldn't visualize that I would have that book. P.S. I did get the book several years later, so I do have the original copy of A Humament, which ran from 1963, I think, to 1967 or so. They did the original. But he keeps on revising it. And so he's still doing it, revising the pages with different copies of the original book. We met for the first time in 1976, and I've kept that relationship with him. And I recently saw him about 3 weeks ago in London. And we've continued to be in correspondence, or also to be in Miami. He's been in Miami once, and I've seen him in London several times. The interesting thing is that all of these individuals, 6, had their own publishing house. So Tom Phillips had Talford Press, which published Dante's Inferno. I don't know whether you have Dante's Inferno here. You did have it at one time. Wonderful artistic book, and also in the trade edition. And the next person will be Dom Sylvester Houdart. And I'm going to show you everything as we go through here. This fellow was born in 1924 and died in 1992. He was born on February 16th, 1924. I was born on February 16th, 1932. And so, but we met only once, and met him in 1980. He was a Benedictine monk. Benedictine monks are not supposed to be talking so much, but he had the head of the order let him go out. He gave lectures. He did all kinds of things. Interesting, he was a member of SOMA. Now, SOMA in UK stood for Society of Mental Awareness. It had Nobel Prize winners in it. It had a lot of artists and poets and writers. And their mission was to change the law on marijuana smoking. Because in the mid-60s, if you smoked marijuana and were caught, you were put in jail for 5 years and had equivalent to $25,000 fine. If you used heroin, which was a drug, you were given a fine and a slap on the wrist, a small fine, because they considered that a drug, so it was okay. And their mission was to change, not to legalize marijuana, but to change the penalty, and which they did by taking a full page in the London Times on why marijuana wasn't harmful. This sounds familiar? This is 1966, right? And we're still talking about it in the election today. And they were successful. And he was one of the major pushers for getting this particular thing done. We visited him once in the Pricknish with Jon Furnival, the next artist I'm going to be talking about, in his garden. And he was an incredible guy. You would talk to him. He could name every concrete visual poet all over the world and tell him where you lived, and he'd give you a whole history. And he wrote a number of papers about concrete and concrete poetry. He was also, in my opinion, the greatest typewriter artist that ever lived. And he typed on an Olivetti 22, letter 22, which is sitting there and is in the hands of Mitchell Kaplan, but it wasn't the same typewriter that Dom Sylvester Houdart used. He was the co-founders of Openings Press that did printed cards and so forth, along with Jon Furnival and a fellow named Edward Wright. Jon Furnival, we met him in 1980, met him several times. He was in Miami. And the thing that he loved about Miami was Joe's Stone Crabs. Every time we see him, we took him to Joe's Stone Crabs. He talks about it all the time, coming back to Miami. Ian Hamilton Finley has emerged as one of the most important contemporary artists, not poets. He was born in 1925 and he died in 2006. We met him in 1980. He was very kind to us, very interesting man. He was an autodidact. He had no training whatsoever, although he knew tremendous about classical literature. And when you walked into his house, books were piled up like this, horizontally, stacked up, of everything you could possibly think of. He was extremely well read. He was also a very important gardener. And his garden in Scotland, Little Sparta, is actually considered a national treasury in Scotland. And you can visit it. It's actually a place now where you can go and look at it as his temple, where he displayed his works and so forth. He started out as a concrete poet, but then he developed into an artist that did sculptures, big sculptures. But he had agoraphobia. You know what agoraphobia is? He couldn't leave his farm where he was. So, though he conceived of these magnificent sculptures, one of which in glass is in the University of San Diego, and then the Max Planck Institute has a large sculpture done by Finley. He never saw the sculpture. It was only the images that he saw. Also, he directed people to do things. He did not physically do very much of anything. He conceived of the project, which artists today are still doing, and then they had to respond to that and present it to him. And if you got it a little bit wrong, he absolutely killed you in his letter. And I know that because I have his archive from 1971 to 1977. And if you look at the material in this, when people made a small mistake, it was almost libelous. So I can't really publish those things because even though he's dead, there still would be a problem there. But when we met him the second time in about 2001, he had calmed down. He had changed completely. He was a different person. He lost his agoraphobia because he had a stroke. Mm-hmm. And the stroke, although he was functioning well, he was a little bit slower. But then he got into a motor car. He went to Normandy, went to England, and so forth. Did all kinds of things which he hadn't done during his lifetime. Very interesting. He founded the Wild Hawthorne Press that made lots of cards and small booklets and so forth, many publications. Bob Cobbing and Josie Johnson invited him to Miami, I think about 1981 or 83, I'm not sure, one of those days. He gave a performance at the University of Miami, and we had a catalog that we developed, photocopied stuff that we had. We met him in 1979, and almost every summer since then until 2000, he died in 2002, we went to see him. And he was a manager of a avant-garde bookshop in London called Better Books. And he had contacts with all the people doing avant-garde poetry and so forth work. And he knew that I was interested in concrete poetry, obviously, that's what the archive is. But he also knew I was interested in typewriter work. And he was a good friend of Dom Sylvester Houdart. And Dom Sylvester Houdart, the Benedictine monk I told you about, was the great typewriter artist. So we bought our first pieces in 1979 before we met Bob Cobbing. From a book dealer, I bought 5 typewriter pieces, and I just loved it. And so when Bob Cobbing told me he had this contact and I could get the typewriter pieces, I said, anything that comes up, I'll buy from you. So he would assemble everything throughout the year. Then he put it on a dining room table, the books and so forth. And I look at the table, he told me what the price is. I just bought the entire table. So I was buying all these works, and I bought probably about 600 typewriter pieces or more, plus manuscripts of Houdart over the years. And since the collection is so large, and we're the only catalogers, I've just noted it, but I really didn't annotate anything until 2012. And Barbara back there has done some of our scanning for us, Barbara over here. And Ruth, of course, is cataloged over here, and I've been here. So we started to catalog. We spent 6 months cataloging stuff that I had bought from Cabin of Dom Sylvester Houdart. And then there was a pop-up exhibition in London at the South London Gallery. And so I lent them images from this book, which probably you don't have because it's a rarity more or less, but you can get it on the internet. It's done by a small publishing house in London. It was a symposium about Dom Sylvester Houdart, which I highly recommend. And when I found out they were doing this, I lent them a number of typewriter pieces that are illustrated in this book. I should also mention that Bob Cabin had his own press too. It was called Writers Forum. He published about 1,100 books, all kinds of stuff. And he had this photo duplicator way of press that was made by Gessner. And they're pretty sloppy works, generally speaking. I mean, the letters are different shades of black and so forth. But it's good because it's like dirty typewriting now. A dirty concrete poetry, which some people think is great now. But of course, he didn't intend to do it that way. He just wanted to dash these things off of his own work and plus many, many other poets, including Allen Ginsberg, by the way. And he spelled Allen Ginsberg's name wrong on first 10 copies. And that became a masterpiece. I saw it on the internet for about $2,000 or $3,000 of one of these misprints. And when there was Ashley's brother put on an exhibition at the University of Pennsylvania of Bob Cabin's work. And when they printed the catalog, again, the University of Pennsylvania screwed up because there were certain catalogs where half of the letters on the sentences were light and the rest were fine. And so I said, Bob Cabin, may he rest in peace, would have loved this because this was a perfect example of the way Bob Cabin printed stuff. But he was a great sound poet and very funny. I mean, he reminded me of some people say he looked like Santa Claus. I thought Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and so forth. He's a little guy, and he always carried this little flask of whiskey in his side pocket, and then every now and then he'd nip it a little bit and so forth. But this is called The Spoken Word of Bob Cabin's sound poems with other people as well. It's done by the British Library, and you can get it on the internet. He also did a book with Houdart. This is a rare book concerning concrete poetry, where he discussed all the examples from the futurist on. And Dom Sylvester Houdart, to show another collaboration, did a chronology of concrete poetry starting from Greek mythology, as a matter of fact, in this book. Because Dom Sylvester Houdart knew all these languages. He was in the British intelligence in 1945 after he was coming from Oxford. Then we have Henri Chopin, and Mitchell tells me he has 2 original Henri Chopins. He was a French poet, sound poet, but also he lived in London, not London, he lived in England, in Essex, and his wife was British, Jean Chopin. And his dates are 1922 to 2008. We met briefly in London at a train station, as a matter of fact. He was going one way, we were going the other way, so we jumped out to the cars and immediately threw some stuff at us. This is how much money it'll be. Buy, okay, buy, it's done. Then we met several other times as well. And he came to Miami Beach, and Mitchell was there, Ruth was there, I don't think anybody, and Josephine, were you there? And he did a demonstration of typing. He did a little bit of sound poetry. He was famous for his sound poetry in that he put the mouth, he didn't really swallow the microphone, but he put the microphone as if he were swallowing it, and then started to give out a lot of gibberish, which is part of sound poetry. He was also a master typewriter. The 3 major typewriter poets in terms of, and I've actually coined the new word for my book. I call it typed art po, because when you look at it, some of it's poetry, but a lot of it's art. And I thought when I started the book that I could separate typed artwork from typed poetry, but I couldn't. So I just say typed Art Poe and I throw it all together. And you'll see examples of this. And this should be familiar to you, Sarah. Whoops. I'll get that. Yeah, let's move that. That slipped off here. Okay. This is Tom Phillips. Can everybody see that? Taken by Sarah Sachner. What year was that, Sarah? 1980. There she is over there. That's my daughter. And here's one of the first prints that Tom Phillips did. It says, Phillips, meet Kensitis. It's an etching from 1963. Phillips was a graduate of Oxford in the 50s, and you'll see some other work by him. And it says a person that looks like this, hard to see because it's a small etching. No, I'm going to flip it over, and it actually happens to be a cigarette, only made in England. So Kensitis is really a cigarette, not a person. That's Tom Phillips' way of doing things. Then we have a magazine from Oxford, and it's not Isis, as you know Isis. This is the goddess that we're talking about, and the cover drawing, and there's some covers inside, are Tom Phillips' work showing that a portrait of somebody, well, a made-up portrait. But what's interesting about Tom is, and that was the whole thing that we realized at the Basel Kunsthalle, is that he works in a parallel fashion. So you can go back to the 60s and find portraits. You can go back and see abstract stuff. You can see visual poetry. And it continues all the way to the day. So he's working in multiple streams rather than serial like most artists do. They continue to refine. He's working parallel. The only contemporary artist that I know that's really successful doing that is Richter, the German artist, who also works in parallel. Tom is also a musician. This is an avant-garde musical score. And then there's instructions in the bottom, what the score looks like. Now, if you have to know that avant-garde musical scores don't necessarily have to have notes as we know them. So this is playable. Then this is from everything I'm talking about, by the way, will be from about 1960 to 1967. I have a lot of material well past that, but I wanted to restrict myself. As you'll see, there's a lot of material anyway. These are preliminary pages from a Humament. This is 1966. It's not in the book. Because Tom has many copies of Humament. He started out with one copy, but when people learned that he was doing this with the book, original book is called A Human Document by Malik, and it can be you can get a reprint on the web of the actual book. So he wrote out. He cannot add anything. He can only subtract. So this is a canceled text. Here's another one from the original one. Original page of a Humament. Preliminary. These are preliminary pages. Studies that most artists would do. And finally, we have Placket 8. This is Jon Furnival's prints, but he's printing Tom Phillips right now. And a series called Placket. Let me get this away real fast, and I'll go on to the next. And let's take this. Yeah, put that aside. Okay, good. You put it down over the other side. Now we'll go on to Houdart. When I start looking at my Houdart work, I told you that I had all these Houdarts. I realized that I probably have the largest collection in the world of Dom Sylvester Houdart. When he died, the monks gave the collection to the University of Manchester. But they don't have all the stuff that I have. They have a very small amount because I've seen what they've archived. And I did have a chance a year ago, it was a year ago, right? We went to the Bricknish Abbey to meet the head man who knew the abbey, who knew Houdart when he was living. He died in 1992. But he was not the head abbey at that particular time. I can tell you that Ruth and I said to ourselves, this guy could convert us. He was so fantastic. I mean, I loved it. I mean, it was Father Francis, that's who it was. And he told us that Houdart was a renegade. Of course, I knew that. So they gave him a third floor. He just had the entire third floor. And he put all his junk in there, all his stuff, his toys and so forth, all the things that he collected, and let him do it. And he also got out of the Abbey and gave lectures in London and so forth, had an exhibition at Lisson Gallery, if you know contemporary galleries in London. It's a very important contemporary gallery in 1966 with the catalog that I have. Again, typewriter work. But in the 50s, he was autodidact as well in terms of art. He did drawings. I didn't bring the religious drawings. He actually did drawings of Saint Benedict, and he's a Benedictine monk, obviously. But this is the surrealistic stuff that he did, these line drawings. And I thought when I brought these to London that somebody would say, okay, we know all about this. Nobody in the audience knew anything about these drawings, which surprised me because people that were there knew him very well. Also, I had slides of colored drawings, and I figured somebody would say, well, I know where they are. No, nobody knew anything. So here is another one, smaller, two people. This is a surrealistic period, and a little Picasso-ist at the same time. Now, he started out simply. 1963 was the big year for concrete poetry, and most of the poets at that time, in fact, all of them, did typewriting. Why? Because it was cheap. They couldn't publish. We didn't have photocopying machines, and they could type, and they had carbon paper, so they could type more than one. Photocopying came in, but it was not easily accessible at that particular time. But they started that way. In fact, the founder of concrete poetry, and I defined concrete, I used Castellanos's definition. Concrete poetry is image words and worded images. I think it's a very brief discussion. You'll see some concrete poetry and you'll get the idea. But what's happened as things have evolved, in 1963, an Italian coined the word poesia visiva, visual poetry. And what it was taking images from newspapers and periodicals and putting text in there and mashing them together, and they called that visual poetry. But then the concrete poets, and some of them, started to put images with their concrete poetry, so they said this is visual poetry. And now today, if you go to exhibits, you'll see visual poetry, but if you look at it, you'll see concrete poetry, visual poetry, and poesia visiva. You'll see it all together. So it's been lumped together. So I have no problem with that. This is one of his typewritings right over here. You can see the word. You can't read it. I'll read it to you. But you get an idea. This is very simple, 1963. This is called Homage to Napoleon III. And he uses initials DSH. This is a carbon copy of one. I have carbon copies and originals. And what it is, in 1963, he did it. 100 years before, in 1863, there was an exhibition in Paris of the Salon artists that did these classical French paintings. But Manet, Pissarro, and Whistler, for example, didn't do that. So he did this homage, and this all these names here in this typing are the poets that were in the Salon that was refused. Napoleon III sponsored it, but the only two artists that actually got into the exhibition were Pissarro and I'm blocking. Pissarro and help me. It's a very famous artist. Starts with a C. No, no. It's he did the Bathers. What's his name? No. Bathers at Philadelphia Museum of Art. Cezanne, yeah. Those are the only two that got into the show, actually. Then most of these typewritings, as I said, they collaborated, they knew each other. This is called Homage to Jon Furnival. And all he has is dots. I guess he thought he was a little scatterbrained at the time, maybe, I don't know. And this is an homage to Henri Chopin, and he types Chopin through it here. And we're talking about 1964. And this is another one. Now, this is more abstract. typewriter. And this is A1 paper, which is larger than the standard typewriter stuff. In 1964, at the end, he started doing, this is all parallel, he was doing type poems. He started as a poet, straight linear poet. I have his poetry before 1963, and now he's doing constructivistic work, all typing. This one's a little naughty. Do you agree?
Yes.
You agree with this?
Oh, yeah.
Pass it around. But I want it back. And then Benedictine monks were not, okay, I won't say anymore. And he also did this is Saul Lewis over here, right? Destroying a variations on a box. More like a Saul Lewis. Not exactly, but I'll make it that way. And he also wrote books. This is done by Bob Cobbing, King Kong, because he also was interested in kinetic poetry. And later on, and I have that in my collection, he actually designed, without ever making them, poetry machines that you would look at, and you could design it on a computer right now, but he didn't have access to that. But theoretically, that's what he did. And somebody in England is doing a PhD thesis on him, and they're going to be doing, they're going to write all about his poetry machines. Jon Furnival was in the same art class as the British artist that lives in L.A., Hackney. And he was considered the best draftsman in the class. Furnival, not Hackney. Here's some of the work that he did from 1961. He also is a linguist. And in our card, I should tell you, which I will pull out right over here, that Sarah Sachner did many years ago. Jon Furnival also knows Russian. So he came, when I gave him our card, you can pass this around. This is Sarah Sachner's design on the side. And she supposed to have designed it as...
From Lisa told me that. Lisa studied Russian.
Well, I thought you knew. You don't take credit for that one.
No, I asked somebody who spoke Russian, how did you say
Right.
poetry?
Anyway, Furnival said, "Why do you have on your poetry visual cement?" The wrong word. You can pass that around. Well, we liked it. It's very, very Dada. I mean, we liked that. It was better than the concrete poetry.
Yeah.
And Furnival did this. This is semiotic poetry, where he's used symbols to give the meaning of the poet. He was not he only did one typewriter poem that I have. And he claims that he didn't do it, but it's in about 4 anthologies. Let me see if I can bring it up here. It's a anti-Vietnam War poem. Did I get my 69 back?
Yes, it's back there.
It's coming.
He also did a placket for himself. And he also did an ISIS cover. This guy, he was more of a lettering artist than he was not a typewriter artist at all, and a great guy. Really, he's done very large standing screens. We have 3 of them in our collection. One of them was in the PAM exhibition. He was asked to do this even though he was going to an art school in Gloucestershire, and this is the Oxford University book. And then we have another Sarah Sachner. She didn't know anything about this, by the way. And if you look over here, you see Jon Furnival. In the background is his wife. This is 1980. Then in the center is Marvin Sachner when he had his beard. Every 15 years he had a beard and then took it off. Hasn't been a long time since I've had one. And here is the great man, Dom Sylvester Houdart. in a relaxed mode, not really in his Benedictine white garments, but in the black dungarees, as a matter of fact, jeans. So that's them. And we go to the next one. How am I doing on time? I started late, didn't I? Okay. Let's go on and get Ian Hamilton Finley. Finley, as I told you, if you got on his bad side, which we never did, could be very, he killed people, really. Here's one, it's called Finley, Hate for Hate. It was a manifesto that he published, mimeograph, because that was the way that either you did typing or you did stencils and then you mimeographed them. This says, hate for hate. We've done it now. We had better make this clear. The wild hawthorn, that's his press, believes in beauty, tradition, experiment, i.e. began with finding of warmth and openness. We are now going to return hate for hate because you, McDermott, you called Mayakovsky and Attila Joseph and Frieder, whatever these people are, and Lorraine Niedacher, many more creators of beauty, fools, and betrayed poetry to your capitalistic press. And on it goes. And he killed the French people, too, for another work that he did. Here is one of his prints from 1963. I'll pass this one around, too, because this is it's called Carousel. I'll go the other way. And you can see the horse, you get the idea of the words with the horses and moving up and down. And this is called Black Block. Can you see it? You see Black Block? Who did the Black Square? Famous painting. Malevich. So this is called Homage to Malevich. Actually, somebody else did something like this, another poet. It was Houdart. But he made a mistake. He called it Homage to Rodchenko, which is not true. Then we have one of his original typewritings by, hard to see because it's on green paper. It was submitted to a journal called Wormwood Review, and it's called Pinget Pong. And it really is based upon a famous poem by Gomringer, the founder of concrete poetry, called Ping Pong. And it turns out that Pinget is a French literary, French writer, and Pong, if you're pronouncing it right, it's French, was a French essayist, poet who also who did criticism on Finley. So he's he's adapted things that he knows into his own work, which is common among the concrete poets. This is one of his small books from 1964, Telegrams from a Windmill, because he did have a windmill in his garden. I remember seeing it, small one. And here he's reproduced typewriter poems throughout. Again, these books are very uncommon. Here's a larger piece of his. It's called Au Pair Girl, playing on pair in English and au pair meaning French, in the French, as you probably know what that is. He also did a publication called Poor Old Tired Horse, which is abbreviated P period, O period, T period, H. And this is a collaboration with Furnival now. So they're Furnival drawings. It went through about 20 issues, I think, from about 1963 to 1967. And finally, one that got away. Every collector has one that got away, and this is one that got away because we would have been good for us now because we live in an apartment, but at that time we lived in a house, had a garden. He was very famous, Finley, for doing sundials. And they were offered to us like this, but we didn't buy it. So it got away. Okay, next. I'm plowing through it, kids. Okay, now Bob Cobbing. This is the cover of the first book that I have of Cobbing, but it's actually Cobbing and Friends of the Writers' Forum. Totally different than what I just told you. This is really fine work, hand-colored and so forth. I told you most of his printing was pretty sloppy, but adorable anyway. And this has the printing inside. He also did typewriting, Again, you can't see this, I know, but I'll just pass it through. But this is interesting because probably you don't know about this. These are 6 photographs from hundreds of prints done at a symposium in London in 1966 called Destruction in Art Symposium. Did anybody hear that? Good for you. In fact, Mitchell probably might even have had a book by Metzger here at one time. And Metzger was the guy that found it. The idea was you got all these people together and you started to destroy everything you could see. So if you brought your own artwork in there, you tore it, you shredded it, stamped on it. If there's a piano, you chopped it to bits, everything you could do. And that lasted 2 days. Of course, it was hard to repeat because everything was destroyed. And this is the announcement of for the Destruction in Art Symposium. And you can see how the paper's all crumpled up and torn and shredded and everything else here in the photographs. And then Chopin would do something like this, over-typing, etc., and proceed to read it. Josephine knows that one. And this would be a sound poem. Now, how you could read anything like this is beyond me, but this is what he did. In fact, it got more abstract, and just like curly-Q lines, he would read it, and he'd chant it, and he'd dance around, and he was just unbelievable, just a super guy. And now, the final one. Whoops. Henri Chopin. And Henri was a very interesting guy because he was in the French army, and he was captured by the Germans and was interned. This is during World War II. And then he got out somehow, and then the Russians captured him and put him into Russia someplace. And he was in his political mind, he was very anti-communist. I mean, a lot of stuff that he did related to Russia, his hatred of Russia. But he also happened to be a great poet and a great publisher. He did a magazine called Revue U, and it had everybody that was the avant-garde contributed to it. A lot of original work, prints, poems, etc. This is a poetry ephemera, as pointed out by Amanda. It's not just the material that you buy and so forth that we collect, but we also collect a lot of ephemeral. The announcements, the exhibition announcements. This is very rare, as a matter of fact. It's 1964. Because most people would just take it, look at it, and destroy it. But we try and preserve it. So the reason why we call ourselves an archive, we really are an archive of archives. So we get the manuscripts, the originals, the things that were not necessarily concrete poetry of that particular poet, all his works, his prints, books, etc. And that's what we do. This is a cover of Ooh. This is a review, and there's a lot of stuff inside, but it gives you an idea of what kind of work he does. Some of these were very elaborate, and we have a complete run. This is some of his typings. Again, these typings are relatively simplistic compared to what he did like 10 years later, when things became multicolored and layered and weaving and so forth. And this one is a little bit risque, but it's in French. And if anybody in French wants to translate it besides Barbara, they can do so. Who wants to translate this one?
I'll give it back.
Who's French?
Okay.
Where?
In the back row.
Come on. Give us a little bit of explanation of this one. Tell us what this is all about.
Il est creux. I don't know what creux means.
That's the whole. That's
But it says naked all around. New.
What is it? What's the title?
Chopin.
No, Vagin.
Le vagin.
You know what that is?
Non, je sais pas.
Anyway, this is a crack. Okay, that's what it says. Okay. Well, and then finally, he also did prints of his typewriter poems as well. And these are small ones. Most of them are very large. Well, I've given you a very quick pass through a lot of things that happened in the 60s. But I think that that you can see that this is a great period for poets and artists to do their thing. Thank you. Okay.
Folks, we have time for questions. So if you just raise your hand, I'll come to you with the microphone. It sometimes takes a little bit for the first person. I'll get you.
Well, it's actually not a question. It's a thank you to Amanda and to Mike Mitchell for asking Marvin to perform, and you can understand why I did not. And also, it gave us both of us a chance to see works that perhaps we haven't seen in years, because as Amanda mentioned, there's so many thousands of work. So thank you to you all for being here to give us a chance to admire our own things. And Marvin, way to go.
Mitchell has a question.
I just want to say that we opened the bookshop about 30 years ago, and some of the passion that I have, was drawn from knowing Ruth and Marvin and seeing their passion for these books that they have developed and their love for all of this work. I remember spending a couple of amazing afternoons going through their archive, and they were so generous in inviting, a punk little bookseller over to meet Tom Phillips. And I remember seeing the entire collection up on your wall, and the typewriter artists as well. So I just have to say that these two people in our community are some of the most remarkable people anywhere in the world, and we are very fortunate to have them right here in Miami. And so I just want to say that to you guys as well. And thank you for all of that. And I also have to say that with Amanda coming on and doing this, I have seen a continuation happen from what you guys are doing to Amanda, and watching it here and what she's doing all over the city. And Miami's just become a hotbed of this now. Who would have ever predicted that in the beginning? So thank you so much, Amanda.
Thank you very much.
And then I do have a question. The question I have is, there were obviously people before the 40s, 50s, 60s doing concrete poetry or visual poetry, the calligrams that Napoleon Iii did and all of that. How were they viewed in context by critics when they were doing their work?
It's just part of the chronology. As I pointed out with the book that I showed here, the cover is concerning concrete poetry, but it has a picture of a futurist poem. So it's a continuum. And you can go back to the Chinese ideograms and the hieroglyphics and Tibetan work and find all this stuff has been done, not before, but done in the same sensibility.
So the form was adapted for contemporary art.
Yeah, the way, I didn't really explain how the term concrete poetry came about. The concrete poetry was coined not in the very beginning when he published it. This is Gomringer, who, and I also should mention, which is also very interesting, that the three founders of concrete poetry, Falstrom, the Nogandres group, which consisted of Augusto de Campos and Araldo de Campos and Decio Pignatera, and Gomringer, all were Latin Americans. Gomringer was Bolivian, but he had Swiss background, and the Nogandres group was Brazilian, as was Falstrom, who was Swedish background, but he was born in Brazil. Gomringer was the secretary to Max Bill, who was doing concrete art, which is really non-objective art, perhaps related in some ways to Suprematism by Malevich, where you looked at forms not in nature, but the way you conceived of them. And Bill did the same thing. Barbara Hepworth was in that group and so forth. And Gomringer wanted to have a poetic counterpart of the concrete art. So his first poem was a poem that's very famous called Silencio Silence. And it's a row of the word Silencio in the grid, but the middle of the grid is not a word, it's just a space. Obviously, that's silence as well. And he also did what's called constellations, where he eliminated the verbs in the poem and just had nouns. And then you had to figure out what the noun might be in your head or visualize it. And he called that concrete poetry because it was really a non-objective form of poetry. And that's how it all got started. And then the poetry that we're accustomed to is abstract poetry, because now we are looking and we have to think. Thanks. We have to conjure an image in our brain by reading the literary content. So that would be abstract poetry. But again, the tradition goes so far back. And by the way, advertising and material relies heavily on concrete poetic ideas. And a lot of these people were in the advertising business as their day job.
Any other questions? Well, if there are none, I just want to thank you again for coming, and thanks, Amanda. And there's more to come.
Name Publications, Jean Marino.
Yeah. Jean Marino will be here next week, I believe. And please make sure you look at all of the stuff that's out there. And again, thank you all. And you know, it's been live streamed so that you can watch it again tonight when you go home. So, or next week if you want. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It was really.